The police officers present at the crime scene some had to undergo psychological treatment, while others struggled with the haunting images for 20 years. The footage of the crime scene was never released due to its disturbing nature. The Aberdeen case is one of the most horrific crimes in Australian history. The perpetrator was the only woman sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, with an unprecedented special directive in her record.
Something hanging, blocking my entry into the hallway of the house. I thought it looked like some type of blanket or some sort of covering that had been placed up on the archway. So I remember I used my left hand to push it aside, and immediately I could feel coldness coming on my left arm. So I looked down and my left arm was just covered in blood.
Welcome everyone. Before we get into today's case, I want to warn you in advance this case contains gruesome, disturbing details, including dismemberment and cooking. If you're not truly ready, feel free to skip this one and check out our other cases.
Disgraceful. I can't comprehend what she's done.
Barbara and Jack Ruffin lived a relatively simple life in Aberdeen, Australia. During their marriage, they had 4 sons. Sometime after their 4th son was born, Barbara began an affair with one of Jack's co-workers, Ken Knight. Barbara and Ken never married but had 4 children together. Their twin daughters were born on the 24th of October, 1955, and one of them was Catherine Mary Knight, born in 1959. When Catherine was just 4 years old, Jack Ruffin passed away, and his 2 older sons, who had been living with him, moved in with Barbara, Ken, and the rest of the children. By 1969, the family moved back to Aberdeen. By then, it was clear that Ken was an abusive alcoholic who beat Barbara multiple times a day, and Barbara played a significant role in the family's instability. She often shared private details about her life with Catherine and her other daughters, expressing how much she despised both men. As a child, Catherine was described by some as loving and kind, while others, including many of her high school classmates, remembered her as a loner and a bully. At one point, she even attacked a male classmate. By the time she left school at 15, Catherine was illiterate. There was a meat processing plant or slaughterhouse in every town her family had lived in, so it was no surprise that she longed to work in one someday. As she grew older, her first job after leaving school was as a cutter at a local clothing factory, where she worked for a year before landing what she considered her dream job, cutting up animal organs at a local slaughterhouse alongside her father, her twin sister Joy, and her brother Charlie. She was quickly promoted to boning meat and was given her own set of butcher knives. She hung them above her bed so they would always be within reach whenever she needed them. She claimed she would continue this habit in every home she lived in. She treasured those knives and viewed them as prized possessions, just as she considered butchering at the slaughterhouse to be a noble profession for life. In 1973, Catherine met 22-year-old David Kellett, a co-worker at the slaughterhouse. They quickly started dating, and a year later, they got married. The couple arrived at their wedding on Catherine's motorcycle. At the wedding, Catherine's mother gave David a chilling piece of advice. Never even think about cheating on her, she'll kill you. And it didn't take long for her violent nature to emerge. On their wedding night, Catherine tried to strangle David. She later explained it was because he had fallen asleep after having sex with her only 3 times. The violence only escalated from there. While pregnant, Catherine burned all of David's clothes and shoes before hitting him in the head with a frying pan. One night, he came home late from a darts competition after making it to the finals. Fearing for his life, he fled to a neighbor's house where he collapsed with a severely fractured skull. The police urged David to press charges against Catherine, but she convinced him to drop them. In 1976, shortly after the birth of their first child, Melissa, and after enduring 3 years of abuse, David finally left Catherine for another woman and moved to Queensland. Catherine was devastated by his departure, and her behavior became even more erratic. She was admitted to a hospital, where she was diagnosed with postpartum depression and spent weeks recovering. Upon being discharged, she quickly packed up her newborn, took the baby to a train station just before a train arrived, and placed the infant on the tracks. She then grabbed an axe and stormed into town, threatening to kill multiple people on her way back to the station. A homeless man rescued 2-month-old Melissa just minutes before the train arrived. Catherine was once again admitted to a hospital, but checked herself out the next day. Unsurprisingly, her behavior remained unchanged. Within days, Catherine slashed a woman's face with one of her beloved knives and forced her to drive her to Queensland to find David. However, when they stopped at a gas station, the woman managed to escape. Catherine then took a young boy hostage and threatened to kill him. When the police arrived, they disarmed her and committed her to another psychiatric hospital. There, Catherine confessed to the nurses that she had planned to kill the mechanic at the gas station because he had repaired David's car, allowing him to leave her. She also admitted that, once in Queensland, she had intended to kill David and his mother. Upon being informed of the incident, David left his girlfriend and moved back to Aberdeen to live with his mother so he could support Catherine in her time of need. After Catherine was released from her latest confinement, she and David moved in together in Ipswich, where she found another slaughterhouse job at Denmore Meatworks. A few years later, they welcomed another daughter, Natasha. However, 4 years later, in 1984, Catherine ended the relationship with David. 2 years later, in 1986, she met 38-year-old David Saunders, a local man. Within months, Catherine and her daughters moved out of their government-provided housing to live with Saunders. Their relationship was volatile, as Catherine constantly suspected Saunders of cheating, often kicking him out of the house. In one horrifying act, she even slit the throat of his 2-month-old puppy right in front of him, warning that this was what would happen to him if he ever betrayed her. Then, in another act of violence similar to what she had done to David Kellett, she struck Saunders in the head with a frying pan, this time knocking him unconscious. Catherine and Saunders had a daughter named Sarah, but their chaotic relationship soon met its end. The breaking point came after an especially violent fight when Catherine hit Saunders in the face with an iron and then stabbed him in the stomach with a pair of scissors. He fled and went into hiding while trying to see his daughter again. Months later, he discovered that Catherine had lied to the police, claiming she was afraid of him in order to obtain a restraining order against him. Catherine continued dating and had a son with another partner before meeting John Price, a divorced father of 3. When he and Catherine met, his 2 eldest children lived with him, while his youngest child stayed with their mother. John's friends and family described him as a wonderful man, well-liked by everyone. He was fully aware of Catherine's violent past, yet in 1995 he allowed her to move into his 3-bedroom bungalow with him and his children. In 1998, Catherine and John got into an argument after he refused to marry her. In a fit of rage, Catherine recorded footage of medical equipment that John had taken from work items that had been discarded as outdated and sent the video to his employer. Despite the items being trash, John was fired after 17 years of service. Furious, he immediately kicked Catherine out of the house. His friends begged him to stay away from her, warning that she was dangerous and manipulative. However, after a few months, John took Catherine back, though he was more cautious this time and did not let her move back in. Their arguments became more frequent, and John's friends were disgusted that he had allowed himself to fall back into such a toxic and dangerous situation. Many chose to cut ties with him. By late February 2000, John had finally had enough of Catherine's abuse. One morning, he woke up to find Catherine standing at the foot of his bed, holding a knife behind her back. That was the breaking point. John ended the relationship and obtained a restraining order against her. He told his friends and coworkers that if he did not show up for work the next day, it would be because Catherine had killed him. His coworkers pleaded with him not to go home, but John was worried about his children's safety and felt he had no choice. On the night of the 1st of March 2000, John returned home. His children were not there. Catherine had sent them to a friend's house for a sleepover. Around 11 p.m., after John had fallen asleep, Catherine woke him up wearing a new, provocative nightgown. They had sex, and afterward, John went back to sleep. Suddenly, he woke up to excruciating pain. Catherine was stabbing him repeatedly. Panicked and bleeding heavily, he stumbled down the hallway, leaving bloodied handprints on the walls as he desperately tried to escape. The next morning, a neighbor was surprised to see John's car still in the driveway, as he was always at work by that time. At the same time, his coworkers grew concerned when he didn't show up for work. One of them went to check on him. The neighbor and coworker knocked on his bedroom window, trying to wake him up. That's when they noticed blood on the front door and immediately called the police. When officers arrived, they forced entry through the back door. What they found inside was so horrific that it continues to haunt them to this day.
Working at Muswellbrook that day, and received a phone call at the station from a workmate of Mr. Price's. I knew Mr. Price before. I knew that he was a hard worker and a reliable man, so it was a bit unusual for him not to turn up for work and not to make a phone call.
As they stepped inside, they were met with a gruesome sight. John Price's skin, completely removed, was hanging from a meat hook in the doorway of the living room. The dim lighting made it difficult to discern at first, and one officer, thinking it was a curtain, brushed it aside only to realize too late that his arm was now smeared with blood. Beyond the hanging skin, officers discovered John's mutilated body on the floor, skinned and decapitated. Catherine had cut off his head and left a note, written in blood, on a photo of John. The note made false and incoherent accusations that John had abused Catherine's daughter. But the horror didn't stop there. Catherine had cooked parts of John's body. She placed his severed head into a large pot and boiled it. She had also cut flesh from his buttocks, turning it into steaks, which she served with baked potatoes, pumpkin, zucchini, cabbage, squash, and gravy. On the dining table, she had carefully set out plates of food, each with a note beside it, the names of John's children written on each one. She had prepared to serve their father's remains to them. A third meal was found discarded in the backyard for unknown reasons, leading to speculation that Catherine had attempted to eat it but couldn't bring herself to do so. This detail was later used to support her claim that she had no memory of the crime. John's severed head was discovered inside a pot filled with vegetables. The pot was still warm, estimated to be between 40 to 50 degrees Celsius, indicating that the cooking had taken place in the early morning hours. A moment later, Catherine arranged the body with the left arm resting on an empty 1.2 5-liter soda bottle with the legs crossed. This was stated in court as a criminal act demonstrating Catherine's contempt for John. Catherine left a handwritten note on a photo of John. There were blood stains and it was covered in small pieces of flesh. The note read, "Time got you back, Johathon, for rapping my doubter. You to Beck for Ross for Little John. Now play with Little John's Dick John Price." The autopsy results later revealed that, drawing from her years of experience slaughtering animals, Catherine had used precise surgical techniques to meticulously dismember John's body. She carefully skinned him from head to toe, leaving the entire skin intact, including all stab wounds, as well as his hair, face, ears, nose, mouth, and genitalia. The skin was then hung from a hook, still dripping with blood, while his legs remained intact, dangling toward the floor. Forensic pathologists estimated that the entire process took approximately 40 minutes, during which Catherine would have been completely covered in blood. Fortunately, John's children never returned home that night. When police arrived, they searched the house and eventually found Catherine unconscious on a bed in a bedroom near the back of the house. She had taken a large number of pills, causing her to pass out, but the dose was not lethal. She survived. After processing the crime scene and analyzing the evidence, authorities determined that after the initial attack, John had woken up and attempted to turn on the light. Catherine then chased him through the house. At some point, he tried to escape, but either she dragged him back inside or he stumbled back on his own. At that moment, he collapsed and bled to death. Catherine had stabbed John 37 times in both the front and back of his body, with many of the wounds deep enough to pierce vital organs. A detective at the scene later described what he saw. John had been standing at one point with arterial blood spraying across his robe and bed. There was a bloody handprint on the doorway, a smear on the western side of the door near the dresser, and blood around the light switch evidence that John had desperately tried to turn the light on. The hallway was covered in blood. After murdering John, Catherine drove into town and withdrew $1,000 from his bank account before returning home to carry out the gruesome acts that police would later uncover. Following the horrific murder of John Price, Catherine's ex-boyfriend, David Kellett, recalled how he had narrowly escaped the same fate. He remembered waking up one morning to find Catherine sitting on his chest, holding a knife to his throat. She had laughed and casually remarked on how easy it would be to kill him. At the time, he didn't realize just how lucky he was. During discussions regarding the charges against Catherine, she attempted to negotiate a plea deal for manslaughter instead of murder. However, her plea offer was rejected. On the 2nd of March 2001, she was formally charged with murder but pleaded not guilty. Her trial began on the 15th of October, 2001. Before the trial adjourned that day, the judge was informed that Catherine intended to change her plea from not guilty to guilty. The judge immediately suspended proceedings for the day and ordered an overnight psychiatric evaluation to determine whether she fully understood the consequences of changing her plea and if she was mentally competent to make such a decision. The next morning, Catherine appeared in court and officially changed her plea to guilty. The jury was dismissed. She never provided a reason for changing her plea, nor did she ever take responsibility for John's murder or her actions afterward. The next step was her sentencing hearing. In a bold move, Catherine's defense team requested that she be allowed to leave the courtroom to avoid hearing some of the more gruesome details of the crime. This was completely absurd. She was essentially asking to be spared from hearing about the horrors she had inflicted. The request was swiftly denied. As details of the crime scene were described, Catherine became hysterical and eventually had to be sedated. When the time came to sentence her, the judge did not hold back. He emphasized the extreme brutality of the crime and noted that Catherine showed no remorse whatsoever. He sentenced Catherine Mary Knight to life in prison without the possibility of parole, marking her case file with the order never to be released, the first time such a ruling had been issued for a woman in Australian history. Catherine expressed no regret or remorse, and authorities determined that if she were ever released, she would pose a severe threat to public safety. This was one of the worst crimes imaginable, and therefore, she had to remain behind bars for life. Catherine Knight is currently serving her life sentence at the Silverwater Correctional Complex under maximum security. Known as Australia's harshest women's prison, it is reported that violence breaks out daily, and that 90% of inmates are drug addicts. Catherine is under constant surveillance by guards who monitor her every move. However, despite the strict supervision, she has managed to build both a reputation and a physical space within the prison that starkly contrasts with her evil nature. She is known as Nana, acting as a mediator for other female inmates, often stepping in before conflicts escalate, preventing theft, and generally assuming a maternal role. She has transformed her prison cell into a cozy retreat, accumulating a large collection of jewelry and trinkets either handcrafted by herself or gifted by others. Since she will remain there for the rest of her life, her fellow inmates note that she might as well make it feel like home. 5 years after her sentencing, Catherine appealed her life sentence, arguing that life without parole was too harsh for her crime. However, judges reviewing the case deemed it an almost unimaginable atrocity in a civilized society. Her appeal was denied. As long as her sentence stands, Catherine Knight will remain in prison for the rest of her life. We hope this ruling brings some small sense of solace to the victim's family. John suffered a tragic fate, and in some ways, his previous husbands were fortunate to have escaped Catherine before things went too far. Thank you for following today's case. Stay tuned for more crime stories from around the world on our channel. Goodbye, and see you next time.